Hi guys, this is Hirosaki. This story is all about what if Naruto was sent to another realm by a goddess. To save an entire world from a madman, one goddess has given the Kages a means to send Naruto to another realm. Will Naruto be able to discover Kushina's divine identity, and can he survive the challenges of being her son? Before we start, kindly like and subscribe to this channel, and look over the description box for the author of this amazing storyline. Welcome aboard. Chapter 33. Naruto was having a restless night as a vision of the past plagued his dream. His dream self was floating above the ancient city of Rome, while a massive army was camped out in a siege around the city. Naruto frowned as he sensed a miasma of darkness emanating from Rome. This miasma was not the stench that came from a city with poor sanitation. This was a foulness that eats at you by merely being in its presence. Naruto had experienced it in the past, such as when he was around Orochimaru, when he encountered certain members of Akatsuki like Tobi, or the zombie twins, or when he had dreams of the Abyss War. The miasma emanating from the city was trying to infect the camp of Goths surrounding the city. However, various runes carved on the banner poles spread around the camp prevented the miasma from spreading. Naruto's viewpoint was then pulled towards the camp. For the most part, the camp looked very normal for a Germanic camp of the time campaigning. Blacksmiths were forging new weapons and armor for the army. Many soldiers were sitting around feasting on wine and food seized from the nearby estates. Naruto's temper spiked as he watched a few of the soldiers here, and they're raping some young women, who had likely been kidnapped from the estates that had provided the food. He knew that such things were regrettably part of the times back when this dream vision was taking place. However, that didn't stop the half-blood shinobi from hating the practice on moral grounds and also opposing it on practical grounds as well. Even if one factored out the massive moral issues with rape, there was also the fact that it was a massive potential vector for disease to spread among an army. Just when Naruto was about to start complaining about what he was seeing, the dream's focus shifted a bit to a nearby Goth lord who was looking on at the same scene as Naruto with disgust in his eyes. The lord walked over to the warriors who were using one of the women for entertainment and lopped off one of their heads. All of the nearby Goths took immediate notice and several pulled out their weapons. One of the warriors tried to avenge his friend and was quickly cut down. He then grabbed the poor battered woman and then covered her with his cloak. Naruto was silently cheering the noble on as he summoned several guards to capture all of the soldiers who were using the local women. Once the rapists were dealt with, the noble walked towards the center of the camp and Naruto's dream self was pulled along as well. The noble came to a large tent near the center of the camp and quickly entered it. There were over a dozen nobles with their king who were looking at a map of Rome that was laid out of the table in the middle of the gathering. Naruto saw the noble he had been following walk up to the king and nod his head. He then said, "It has been done, Lord Alaric." King Alaric nodded his head and said, "Good. Send the captured women out of the camp with a small group of guards who you can trust. The guards will take the women to the convent here." Alaric paused to point a map of Italy that was lying next to the map of Rome. The noble in question eyes widened slightly, seeing that the convent Alaric was pointing to was almost 2 weeks away. Alaric saw the surprise in the noble's eyes and said, "A portion of the loot from Rome will be set aside for the guards. The women must make it to this convent since its isolation will enable them to heal from the torments our former warriors inflicted on them." A few of the nobles looked upset over Alaric's actions. Alaric noticed their discontent and firmly said, "My orders stand. When we take Rome tomorrow, the men may take all of the material goods from the city that they wish. However, the citizens of the city are to be left alone. Despite what the Roman emperor and his advisors think, we are not savage animals. The wealth of Rome itself will be recompense for our thankless years of fighting and dying for an empire that sees us as worth less than a dog. Remember, we would not be here if the Romans had honored their promises to us." Silence filled the tent for a few seconds. Alaric then looked at nobles in his tent and said, "Now, why don't we all break for the night? It is getting late and the battle tomorrow will be hard work." The nobles around the table nodded their heads and slowly left the tent talking with each other. Once everyone had left, Alaric walked over to his chair and slumped down in exhaustion. He then rested his head on a hand and sighed. Mother, uncle, forefathers, why have I been forced to handle this task? All I want is a place where my people can call home. Why couldn't those pompous, backstabbing, honorless swine who called themselves the emperor's advisors have just given his men what they promised? Pannonia was practically empty of Romans, and while maybe not the absolute best land in the empire, it is very good land for my people. Alaric's eyes then drifted over to a box that was heavily cloaked by the weave. It was so heavily cloaked that even ansas like him needed a special blessing in order to see the box. Alaric sighed again and muttered to himself. Tomorrow is going to be a very bloody and ugly day. Naruto was suddenly pulled from his dream vision by one of his movement alarm seals going off and waking him via a chakra thread. The young ninja instantly bolted away and had his hand on a kunai as he started to look around for the source of movement. He relaxed when Zoe was revealed to be up and walking about. Zoe whirled around and saw Naruto wake up. She saw him relaxed after spotting her, and then he pulled his hand away from the kunai he was a second away from unclipping. A faint blush of embarrassment appeared on her cheeks, which was thankfully covered by the low visibility of the camp at night. Zoe knew that Naruto had ways of detecting movement that she wasn't used to dealing with. However, her pride was still trying to accept that as easily as her mind had. It was a point of pride for Zoe that she could be extremely stealthy when she wished to be. The shinobi half-blood got up so that he was sitting Indian style on the floor. Naruto looked at Zoe and asked, "Well, since I'm up, what is bothering you, Zoe?" After thinking about it for a moment, Zoe sat down in front of Naruto. She then said in a tired voice, "I don't like how everything keeps changing. For millennia things have remained virtually unchanged. Technology has improved, but it was at a generally slow, easily assimilated rate. The heart of the West moved from time to time. However, everyone mostly acted as they always did, so the location never became too important." She paused for a moment to look up at the moon, hoping to draw strength from her mistress's chariot. Zoe wasn't comfortable talking about all of this with Naruto, but she needed to get this off of her chest, and she knew that she could trust Naruto to keep his mouth shut. For someone who could be quite boisterous at times, he could be very tight-lipped when it came to things that he needed to keep secret for other people. I have seen more changes and surprises these last 2 decades than I have in any 2 centuries that I have been with the hunt. Plus, I know that there are several major changes coming up soon in the future. Who knows what else has been woven that will surprise us? A small chuckle escaped Naruto's lips as a thoughtful look appeared on his face. "I sort of know what you mean, Zoe. While I may not have the experience of living an extremely long life, I do have plenty of experience with major changes in my life. Some major changes were good, some were horrifying, several were depressing, and a few knocked me off of my feet. All I can say is that the only way to deal with the changes is to accept them one day at a time." Zoe frowned slightly and replied, "I suppose that is true. However, let's just say that when you're used to thinking in terms of seasons and decades for planning purposes, it is very difficult to speed up your perceptions of time. It's one thing if you're reacting in a fight or in a hunt, since those are mostly instinctual. But when it's something that requires a lot of thought, it is very difficult." Naruto shrugged his shoulders and said, "I'll take your word for it, Zoe. However, I would like to remind you that your family and friends will be there for you to help you through this. You've got quite a lot considering your friends at camp, your sisters, your mother, and your potential father." "What do you mean by my sisters, my mother, or my potential father, Naruto? My sisters consider me dead to them and wiped from history. My mother sadly faded centuries ago. As for my sire, I refuse to speak of him." The comment about her sisters confused Naruto of a moment, until he realized that Zoe was referring to her biological family. To answer the hunter's question, he simply pulled out a scroll, unsealed some papers from it, and handed a subsection of the papers to Zoe. Even with the poor night light, she was able to read the document. Her eyes widened in surprise, and she turned to look at Naruto, almost gaping like a fish. The hunter said in a shocked voice, "Adoption papers?" Gently taking the papers back, Naruto nodded his head and answered her question. "I know that Artemis views all of the hunters as her daughters rather than merely being handmaidens. That's why she's in the situation she currently is in thanks to my birth. My thought was that if I cannot free her from the bargain, the least I could do is make the Hunt family in law as well as in fact." Disbelief filled Zoe's face as she tried to form a coherent thought in her mind. It was an open secret in the Hunt that all of the hunters viewed Artemis as a beloved older sister and as a mother figure. The fact that Artemis returned those feelings was one of the major reasons why the hunters had been willing to tolerate Naruto courting their goddess. If their mistress was merely doing it out of sense of obligation, then there would have been a mass suicide of hunters a couple of years ago. However, the thought that they might actually become Artemis's daughters, even if it was just by adoption, was something that all of the hunters thought could never come true. Misreading Zoe's disbelief, Naruto quickly spoke. "Honest, these adoption papers are 100% legitimate back in Konoha. All it needs is each hunter's signature on their adoption papers, the Uzumaki clan seal which Artemis has, and the Hokage's signature to have the adoption take effect. Back when I was much younger, one of my fondest wishes was for someone to adopt me, so I memorized the forms hoping for the day someone would use them for me." That bit of information managed to reset Zoe's mental switch back to the on position. She did not like what she knew of Naruto's childhood in the least. Child abuse was something that disgusted her no matter the gender of the child, and what happened to Naruto was too close to abuse or minor levels of abuse in various areas to sit well with her. Zoe was just thankful that Naruto had emerged from his first childhood in much better condition than most people would. She then gave a small smile and said, "I have no doubt that the forms are correct, Naruto. If Lady Artemis agrees, I and the rest of the hunters will most likely accept your offer of adoption. Now, I think it is time I try to get more rest." With that said, Zoe returned to her sleeping bag and got back in it. The next morning, the questing trio quickly had breakfast and made a break for Las Vegas, which was where Zoe had found out the other Heptad base was located. Thankfully, they were able to make it into the city before the desert sun could become a problem. The trio did not immediately head to the address given for the Heptad base. Only a complete idiot wouldn't expect Heptad to be on alert for them, and the mirror had undoubtedly been moved. Maybe if they had been able to find and reach the base before the mysterious member who fled from the base near Mount St. Helens, it would have been a different story. It was an unlikely possibility since Heptad appeared to be comfortable mixing in mortal means in addition to the mythical. Bucephalus and Skullsplitter were extremely fast, but they weren't faster than a phone call. Issei had wondered if Heptad might still have the Yata no Kagami at their Las Vegas base. After all, wouldn't Heptad consider it better to keep the mirror in a defensible location rather than move it? Also, what reason did Heptad have to consider that the trio could even find the Las Vegas base in the first place? Both Zoe and Naruto had to explain to their companion that what he was suggesting was utter stupidity for an organization that was trying to hide. Naruto knew this from his ninja training and specialized training from Jiraiya in being a spy master. Zoe had learned all of this the hard way hunting down criminals who Artemis decided needed to be removed for their crimes against women. Hoping your enemy had caught the idiot ball, especially for one as competently ruthless as Heptad was showing itself to be, qualified one for a Darwin Award. The trio stopped at the closest park to City Hall and dismounted. Zoe quickly led Bucephalus and Skullsplitter to an area of the park that had fresh water and started to hide them with the mist. Issei turned to Naruto and asked, "Okay, Naruto. Why are we heading to City Hall? I'm just not seeing how it helps on our quest." Naruto gave his friend a smile and said, "We're going after information. Our primary target has undoubtedly been moved, but there is probably a lot of useful information for us at the base that Heptad wasn't able to move before they left. Just knocking down the front door without any information on the facility is very stupid if there are ways to get said information in a timely manner. The base is in the city, which means that its basic floor plans and the floor plans of any nearby buildings are registered at City Hall. With those plans we can anticipate most potential trap locations or areas where any possible remaining Heptad forces could likely attack us from. An uneasy look crossed Issei's face when he was told that. Naruto's stated reasoning for going to City Hall made some sense to biggest mortal pervert of the century. Issei would be the first to admit that his skills at espionage did not go beyond how to sneak a glimpse inside the girls' locker room. However, something didn't sit right with him. Just how much can we trust the plans in the city records? I mean, couldn't Heptad have completely changed the interior of the building? This caused the shinobi to shake his head. That is very unlikely, Issei. If Heptad had used mystical means to rebuild the interior of their base, then they would have been noticed. I'm not an expert on it by any stretch of the imagination, but from what I've been told, the magic involved in something like that is very attention-grabbing. Naruto paused for a second to give Zoe a questioning looks for confirmation. Once the hunter nodded her head, he continued. Since Heptad is trying to say under the radar for the mystical, that excludes mystical means of construction. Naruto paused for a second so that he could remember all of the differences between the United States and the Land of Fire when it came to buildings and record-keeping. Once he had made sure his facts were straight, he continued his explanation. Mortal means of renovations require a lot of permits and permissions that will be on file in the records. These can't be faked or hidden by the mist, since you'll have the receipts and delivery records by the companies who do the work. Those same companies typically need to confirm that all of the permits are on record before they do any work. Most of the time Naruto found the amount of red tape that existed in America to be bewildering. For all that the noble courts back home were supposed to be about an organized and accurate accounting, what Naruto had seen in America made them look like complete slobs. However, in this situation, that red tape was a blessing from heaven. It was so much simpler to try and find out about a building and its layout when it was all written down in a public location. A slightly guarded public location and out of normal public access, but that wasn't a problem for Naruto. The trio then spent the next 15 minutes hashing out what their cover story was and getting all of the details straight. They were going to use the mist to get themselves access. However, the mist always worked best when used by a group if everyone was creating the same illusion. It was trickier than having just one person manipulate the mist. The payoff came with the fact that multiple minor manipulation was less intensive on the manipulators than a massive manipulation. Also, the minor illusions reinforced themselves to become even more powerful than anything a half-blood could do on their own. Once the trio was ready, they left the park and walked towards City Hall. Before they had walked a block, Naruto had to grab onto Issei's shoulder twice and give a strong squeeze to keep the overly hormonal boy from chasing after some scantily clad women. At the same time, Zoe was fighting the urge to smack Issei on the back of the head. She was half-seriously pondering whether or not gelding Issei would cause his perversion to lower to the typical level of a normal male. The only good thing that Zoe could say about Issei on that matter was that for all of his perversion, he would only move past looking if he had a willing partner. She never wanted to see Issei again once this quest was complete, but she wasn't about to put his name up for nomination as someone her mistress should kill as an enemy maidens. Suggesting he spend a few weeks or months as a jackalope was still in the cards though. The trio entered City Hall and headed to one of the receptionist's desks. Zoe started the first bit of mist manipulation just before she greeted the receptionist. "Good morning, ma'am." There was a second delay as the seasoned receptionist paused what she was doing to look at the trio standing in front of her. She gave them a smile and said, "Good morning, children. It's not often we people as young as you here. What can I help you with today?" Zoe kept a respectful look on her face, ignoring the children remark, and continued to speak for the trio. "We're here for the school project from the John D. Rockefeller Memorial Academy for Future Business and Science Leaders. We arranged almost 2 months ago for access to the city's archives for urban plans as part of our school's summer project. Can we please have the passes to the archives?" As planned, the mist caused the receptionist to become friendlier than usual. It didn't overpower her senses and make her hand over the passes. Zoe was skilled enough in mist manipulation to achieve that. However, the trio felt that such tactics had the potential to cause too many problems for them. The fact that the security guard who was watching everything through the security camera might find it all very odd to see the receptionist just handing out the passes for one. The mist could create very real and believable illusions that fooled regular mortals easily. Computers were a completely different matter, and the trio had no idea what kind of automatic systems might be in the city hall. The receptionist started to check the system and naturally could not find the reservation that Zoe had told her about. A frown appeared on her face and she said, "I'm sorry, dear, but the system is not showing a mention about teenagers being granted access to the archives for a school project." Naruto turned to face Issei and said, "Are you sure that this is the correct date and time, Issei? You were tasked with arranging the passes for us on this project. If we have to go back through the school to arrange things, Mr. Burner is going to penalize us 5% from the final grade for failing to meet the project goals that were set for the pre-summer vacation milestone." A minor twist of the mist increased the receptionist's sympathy for the trio. Issei nodded his head and quickly answered according to plan. "I did, Naruto. Mr. Burner was there when I made the call and arranged for our passes today. He told me that I documented everything better than he expected. If I had my project logbook on me, I could show you everything. The only thing I can think of is that the person I talked to had sounded pretty tired and hurried, like they were handling several tasks at once. Maybe my call got misfiled or wasn't entered into the system because the person I talked to got pulled away for another task." The subtitle manipulations of the trio merged in the receptionist's mind and shaped themselves to fit with her memories. She frowned and sighed. "You must have called back when the bug was making its way through the office. Several of us were out at the time and Becky was still in training. Things were pretty hectic then, so I'm sorry to say your passes were probably misplaced." Naruto nodded his head and then said, "I guess these things happen. Looks like we'll have to write all of this down and inform Mr. Burner. Hopefully, he'll be willing to grant us a special dispensation from the penalty since this was completely out of our control. Can we set up our new pastime right now?" A small smile appeared on the receptionist's face as she started to type on her computer. In a sweet voice she said, "I can do one better, you three. If you'll just wait a few minutes, I can authorize you three to have access to the archives like you were promised." Zoe's eyes widened slightly as needed for the act and cheerfully said, "Really, Ms.? Oh, thank you for doing this for us. This won't cause you any trouble, will it?" This final manipulation locked everything in place by reinforcing the prior alterations made with the mist. The receptionist shook her head. "It's not a trouble at all, Mississippi. This whole mess was our fault, and I am merely correcting a mistake on the office's part." She then asked for the trio's name to complete the paperwork. After she finished typing everything up, the receptionist printed out 3 temporary passes and handed them to the trio. It took the trio almost 3 hours to find all of the relevant documents and make copies of them. Issei turned out to be hopeless when it came to finding regular information. On the flip side, he was practically a bloodhound when it came to sniffing out anything provocative or risque. The record room was apparently City Hall's designated place to hide anything that was not safe for work, even when one worked in Las Vegas. The amount of porn and other questionable items Issei found had left the pervert happy, Naruto in disbelief, and Zoe contemplating arson. Besides Issei's hunt for hentai loot, Naruto's and Zoe's own efforts to find the plans were plagued by their own issues. Zoe was not used to book research. It just wasn't a skill that she needs to develop as a hunter. Artemis's followers spent most of their time in the woods, and it wasn't like they were doing term papers to pass the time. For his part, Naruto was simply drowning in too much information. He was used to looking much harder for much less information, and then trying to puzzle out the facts from what he could find. The occasional reports he had to do in school had helped a bit, but unfamiliarity with many of the American legal document types negated that edge. The trio was currently in a local sub-shop having lunch and waiting out the heat. Naruto had sent a clone out to make sure their steeds had fresh water. A portable altar was set up between Naruto and Zoe. They used the mist to make the altar seem to be a regular candle like the shop normally kept on their tables. Issei just shook his head slightly when he saw Naruto and Zoe make their sacrifices. It just didn't make any sense in Issei's mind why anyone would just waste good food. If an aunt wanted to make a minor sacrifice to a god, they'd simply hunt something and hang the kill by the neck from an old tree, preferably an oak or a yew tree if one could be found. Norns knew that Issei had made plenty of sacrifices to his mother's superiors when he got in trouble in the hopes of getting a light sentence. Once the trio finished eating, they put their plates to the side and pulled out a copy of the blueprints for Heptad's base. It was a warehouse on the outer edges of the city. The front Heptad was using for the location was that they were operating an internet casino along with in-house shipping of various prizes across the country. Naruto figured that the facility had to be a communications hub of some sort for Heptad given the various permits and construction liens placed on the warehouse for fiber optic installation along with other more traditional communication connections. Part of Naruto really wished he knew more details about modern mortal communication methods. If he knew that, it would be a Tartarus of a lot easier for him to figure out just how important the base was for Heptad's communications. For all he knew, this could be a small local hub, a regional hub, or the heart of communications for North America to Heptad. Naruto sat back in his chair and shook his head. Assaulting bases with such unknowns was asking for trouble. He couldn't ask Taichi for help since she apparently had it out for him for some reason. Benzaiten might be in his corner, but Naruto didn't want to push the goddess of the elemental nations when it came to counteracting Taichi. The level of importance of the facility to Heptad's communications would have a major effect on the organization's actions. A relatively unimportant facility could be written off and abandoned completely. If the facility was critical, then there likely would be stiff resistance even though the mirror was undoubtedly gone. Another thing that concerned Naruto was the interior layout of the facility. Over the past decade and a half that the facility had been owned by Heptad, a troubling fact all on its own, it had undergone a series of renovations. On their own, the renovations were simple and harmless enough. In many cases they even seemed to be logical outgrowths of prior renovations. When added all together, the renovations to the facility turned it into a nightmare to attack. Anyone assaulting the facility would find themselves forced to loop around and around the building in a spiral with periodic choke points until they reached the center where of the building there was a large room on the blueprints labeled computer cores. A room which apparently had its own air filtration and cooling system. The core room had to be either some kind of a vault or a command center for Heptad. The only way to get to it easily would be to smash through the walls to get to the room, and that wasn't a very bright idea. Heptad had all the walls built reinforced, and there was wiring all over the place. Definitely lent weight to the idea that this facility was of some importance to Heptad. A glance at his companions told Naruto that Zoe and Issei were seeing the same problems that he had. The question was, what they would do about them to progress on the quest. Chapter 34. Early evening found the trio of Naruto, Zoe, and Issei hiding the building across the street from the Heptad base's main entrance. The trio all had binoculars to their faces as they visually scanned the premises for guards or any changes from the blueprints they had acquired earlier in the day. Naruto put down his binoculars and created a shadow clone. Seconds later the clone popped out of existence with almost no smoke to pass along a message to the clones watching the building from other angles. The shinobi closed his eyes and focused on the memories from the various clones as they came to him. Once Naruto had reviewed the memories, he spoke up, "There is no advantage to attacking one of the side entrances. All are equally guarded and these guards are all alert and have radios for quick backup. At least half a dozen other people have been spotted from their shadows in the upper level windows. It looks like this base is important like we feared. Furthermore, it seems that all of the guards are mortal." Zoe frowned as she took off her quiver full of celestial bronze arrows and sealed it away into a seal on her belt. "Given Heptad's forces at that other base, we really should have expected that." She then activated another seal on her belt to unseal a quiver full of steel-tipped arrows. The hunter then calmly put the quiver on her back and resumed her observations of the building. As she did that, Issei changed out the rounds in his hunting rifle from cold iron to mortal hollow-point rounds. In many ways, the Fates had been very wise when they set the conditions for Naruto's companions. Chiron and Camp Half-Blood were fairly good at training half-bloods in how to survive. That training had only gotten better with the increase in resources and training available to the camp. However, it had one glaring weakness. Campers were not trained to deal with taking human lives. They could handle fighting and killing monsters, but mortals were a totally different kettle of fish. This quest already had a large mortal body count, and it was about to rise. Zoe and Issei did not have those issues since both of them were blooded warriors like Naruto. Issei hadn't killed a mortal before this quest, but his training had prepped him for the shock and aftereffects of taking a human life. As for Zoe, she grew up in a much more violent time, and had sent at least a dozen boatloads of customers to Sharon. That's not to say that the former nymph was a cold-blooded killer, she just had plenty of experience with killing over her long life. Naruto created several shadow clones, and had them transformed to look like a gang of teenagers. He then nodded to Issei and Zoe, letting them know that the mission was getting ready to start. Issei and Zoe quickly picked their targets and waited for the signal to start shooting. Naruto was focusing on manipulating the mist to create a barrier around the warehouse that would turn anyone approaching it or heading in the general area away by convincing them they had somewhere else they needed to be. Things were about to get bloody enough without adding bystanders into the mix. The gang of shadow clones started walking towards the guards in a way that made it look like they had just been walking down the street. One of the clones started to jeer at the guards and the others joined in. At first the guards took the insults. However, it was plain to anyone who was looking at them that the guards were barely able to restrain themselves from lashing out. All restraint was lost when one of the clones on a hunch made a particularly insulting remark about a certain religious figure. Just as Naruto suspected, Heptad had recruited religious extremists to be their mortal agents who were under the impression that they were here to wage jihad against the infidels. Zoe and Issei quickly shot the guards furthest away from the clones. The magic in Issei's rifle muzzled its noise level to that of a movie silencer. At the same time, the clones pulled out their kunai and quickly gutted the nearest guards. In less than 5 seconds it was all over and the guards were dead. The trio broke from their hiding spot and quickly ran to the door. Naruto's clones were dragging the dead guards away to hide their bodies. It would make the mortal repealing mist construct work more efficiently than if it had to hide the bodies. The trio waited next to the door for a few seconds for the clones to check to see if any guards were heading towards them. Naruto stood next to the door and kicked it open as soon as the clones popped to give the all clear. Zoe and Issei rushed into the open doorway and hollered clear. Knowing that every second could be precious, the trio rushed down the hallway to the next door. Naruto created a couple of clones as he was running. Hera's son then took a similar position with the new door as he had with the door to the exit. The door was kicked down and this time the clones rushed in before Issei and Zoe went in to provide cover fire. Good thing that the clones went in first as one of them received a 9mm in the gut from a Heptad guard in the new corridor. Issei killed that guard by punching his nose in with his gauntlet-covered fist. Another guard was reaching for his gun, but Zoe shot him before he could respond. In a similar manner the trio zigzagged their way around the Heptad base. Sometimes they would come across empty rooms and other times they would encounter resistance. Naruto tried to use his sensor abilities to give Zoe and Issei an edge by creating enough clones to protect them as they entered the room. He left the clones he made behind in the rooms to help protect their rear and to search for anything useful. There was one close call when a guard grazed Issei's shoulder. A clone was able to kill that guard before he fired a second shot. Another clone had helped Issei put on a bandage while moving. Speed was the trio's best ally against Heptad. Their attack was simply too fast for Heptad's forces in the base to organize against. They had built their base in such a way that it would be a nightmare for a SWAT team to go against without extremely heavy losses. Their training and response times were therefore geared for a more cautious enemy. Heptad's plan was rather simple and still effective: lock their enemies in place and allow more of their people to join in the shooting fest. Things got too dire, they could always use the sprinkler system to launch a chemical attack on the enemy. Fortunately for the trio, they were moving way too fast for Heptad's plans. It took time to ready the system so that a chemical attack could be launched. Heptad also only kept a very limited amount on hand at any one time. Keeping extremely toxic chemicals on hand in great quantities when most of your personnel wanted to die in a holy war against a people they viewed as a great evil while hiding in a city synonymous with sin and debauchery was not a good idea. At least, it wasn't a smart idea if one wanted to keep their workers alive and remain undetected. The question of the use of a chemical weapon soon became irrelevant when the trio forced their way into one of the rooms close to the area marked on the plans as the computer core. The room was unimportant to the trio, as it only had two guys sitting at desktops typing away. A shadow clone shuriken in the back of each worker's head eliminated the duo in charge of the base's chemical attack system before they could get up from their chairs. Since it was a small room, Naruto merely left a single clone to try and investigate the room as the trio continued on to the next room. Momentum for the trio's blitzkrieg finally slowed when they reached the door to the computer core at the heart of Heptad's facility. Naruto gave the metal door a firm kick just like he had all of the others, only this time the door did not move. He frowned for a second and kicked the door harder, only for a 4-inch deep impression of his foot to appear. Two more powerful and swift kicks created matching impressions in the door. The shinobi turned to face his companions and said, "Back away from the door. This one is seriously reinforced, so whatever is beyond it must be extremely important." Naruto walked about 6 feet back away from the door. He paused for a second to make sure Zoe and Issei were clear of his path, and then started to run to the door. At the last possible second, Naruto preformed a spin kick that connected with the center of the door, sending it flying 5 feet. He quickly rushed through the open door with his kunai drawn, ready to take advantage of any surprise the flying door would have caused. The other two members of the trio hurried into the room hot on Naruto's heels. All three members of the trio stopped in their tracks when they got a good look at what was inside the so-called computer core room. Issei blurted out, "Oh, now that's just bullshit." Standing in front of the trio was something straight out of a cyberpunk nightmare. A new version of the Minotaur stood ready for its first task of combat. This Minotaur was 40% larger in all proportions from the Minotaur that Theseus and every subsequent half-blood had killed. The lower half of this Minotaur's right arm had been removed and a rotary autocannon put in its place. This autocannon was belt-fed from an armored backpack that seemed to have been merged with the monster's back. Armor of some mystical sort that the trio couldn't recognize appeared to have been bolted onto the beast. One of its eyes was replaced with a camera with an additional laser-guided system attached. In the Cybertaur's hand was a wicked-looking double-headed axe that had blades larger than Naruto's head. It quickly became clear why the Cybertaur's eye had been replaced as the monster locked onto the trio and pointed its autocannon at them. All members of the quest were shocked at seeing the modern and the mystical mixed in an unholy manner. Zoe was in the most shock, but even she was able to listen to her instincts that screamed at her to get out of the way. The trio bolted just in time as a steady stream of .50 caliber bullets were shot from the autocannon. Naruto quickly created a dozen clones who started creating barrier seals for protection. Thank Taichi, the autocannon the Cybertaur was packing wasn't shooting bullets at machine gun level speeds. However, there wasn't much to be thankful for, as a .50 caliber bullet fired each second in an enclosed space by an enemy will still ruin someone's day. Once some of the clones were ready, they switched themselves with objects near Zoe and Issei. They then activated the barrier seals to give the trio some time to think. As Cybertaur continued to fire its autocannon into Naruto's barrier, the barrier started to waver. Naruto got an idea and started to prep a Rasengan cannon. He nodded to one of his clones that was behind the barrier protecting him, and gave it a look towards the corner. The shadow clone got the message and dashed off behind the corner. The other three clones got in front of Naruto ready to act as ablative shields. Cybertor let out a roar of bloodlust as its latest shot broke the barrier. A smirk appeared on Naruto's face as he fired the Rasengan cannon at Cybertor, and then used the Kawarimi Jutsu to change place with the clone that was behind the corner. The Rasengan flew true and hit the muzzle of the autocannon just as another bullet was coming out of the barrel. An explosion was heard throughout the computer core room, and it was so loud that the trio were forced to cover their ears. Seconds later, the trio were able to uncover their ears and glance at Cybertor. Issei let out a small holler of success when he saw that Naruto's Rasengan had completely destroyed Cybertor's autocannon. Now, they had a solid shot at putting this monster down. Cybertor's ear twitched at Issei's yell, and the beast whipped around to face the young aunts. The monster gathered some spit and then spat at Issei. A hissing sound could be heard when Cybertor's spit landed on the ground, revealing that it was an extremely potent acid. Naruto drew his Kanabo and charged it with Wind Chakra, giving the Battle Club the additional cutting properties of a sword. He tried to take advantage of Cybertor's distraction and score a solid hit. However, those ears on the beast's head were extremely sensitive, and the monster was far faster than his build would suggest. The Kanabo was quickly parried by the double-headed axe wielded by the cybernetic beast. A split second later, the parry was followed with a counterstrike that Naruto was able to block. While Naruto kept the attention of Cybertor, Zoe and Issei turned to look at each other so they could think about what to do. Zoe whispered, "Do you have any ranged weapons besides that rifle?" Issei shook his head. Zoe then commanded, "Get your hands on any valuable-looking documents of devices that look like they could be destroyed. I'll help Naruto with my bow." Normally, Zoe would not try to use her bow at this short of a range, and instead use her hunting knives. This was not a normal situation as there wasn't really room for two people to maneuver against another opponent effectively in close-quarters combat. Zoe pulled out her bow as quietly as she could and carefully drew an arrow. She was now ready for the hard part with her arrow notched and bow ready to release. Her eyes narrowed as she tried to predict exactly where Naruto and Cybertor were moving, and how they would react to each other and any actions on her part. This was the hardest kind of shot a markswoman could try to make even if she had the good fortune of being very close to her target. The slightest mistake on her part would cause Cybertor to turn on her and possibly kill her before she could react. Or, she could possibly hit Naruto instead of Cybertor. A stroke of luck occurred when Zoe was able to spot Cybertor preparing for a powerful strike. She quickly released an arrow which flew straight and true, burying itself deep in Cybertor's back at an impressive angle between the armor plates of the monster's shoulder blade and its back. A bellow of pain and anguish erupted from the beast. This primal bellow came to an abrupt end when Naruto slammed his Kanabo into Cybertor's head, smashing the beast's skull. The beast's body collapsed onto the floor in front of Naruto. Before the trio could say or do anything, something completely unexpected happened. Sparks of black and red electricity started to arc across Cybertor's body. These sparks grew larger and brighter by the second. Soon all of the electricity started to gather around Cybertor's chest into an infinity loop. An aura of dread started to fill the room as the infinity loop shifted in color from red/black into gold. That feeling of dread grew even greater as the golden loop sunk into Cybertor's chest. Once the loop vanished, the monster's body began to slowly disintegrate in the normal manner of Western monster, leaving behind a wrecked autocannon trophy and 3 very confused questers. Later that night, Zoe stood in front of a small pond using her minuscule inherited control of water to create a small geyser so that she could send an iris message. Zoe tossed a drachma into the spray of water, saying, "Goddess Iris, I ask to speak with my mistress, the Lady Artemis." Artemis appeared in the mist almost a minute later, looking a bit embarrassed with her hair wet and the edges of a bathrobe appearing in the headshot of the goddess. Zoe looks down slightly in respect and said, "I'm sorry to call you at an inconvenient time, my lady." The goddess shook her head and quickly said, "It's not an inconvenient time for me to talk to you, Zoe. If something has come up that requires you to talk to me while on your quest, it must be important." Artemis had complete confidence in her lieutenant's abilities and experience. She was a little annoyed to have her bath interrupted. However, the goddess figured that her old friend's concerns were more important than a little creature comfort. Zoe quickly related to Artemis everything that had happened regarding Cybertor, and gave the goddess a little background on Heptad as part of the explanation. A frown appeared on Artemis's face, and she closed her eyes trying to recall everything she knew about monsters and every esoteric fact about them that she knew as the goddess of the hunt. The frown deepened as she remembered everything relevant to what Zoe had told her. When Artemis opened her eyes, they were filled with stormy resolution. She then said, "Zoe, what you and your quest companions witnessed was a monster becoming an archetype and gaining a monster's style of immortality. Such a thing hasn't occurred in millennia. I'm not surprised you didn't know what you observed, since such occurrences are extremely rare, and the last one occurred centuries before you joined the hunt. Most monsters are either born as monstrous archetypes, or were transformed into one by a god. What is even more concerning is the fact that this Heptad group was able to create a new monster, and even do so without any of us knowing about it. I trust that I don't have to tell you just how dangerous this is, Zoe." The lieutenant nodded her head in full agreement. Even if Cybertor's creation would turn out to be cost prohibitive or require significant mystical backing of some sort, the fact that mortals had created a real monster in the true sense changed everything. It would have a psychological effect on Olympus somewhat on the order of what the 9/11 event was having on the mortals of the United States, but on a much grander scale. The only reason Artemis wasn't freaking out over the news Zoe had given her was she had already had several massive paradigm changes over the past few years. After a short pause, Artemis continued to speak. "Beyond the effects this knowledge will have on Olympus, I am very concerned about Cybertor itself. A monster with its capacities will be extremely dangerous for the hunt and for the Half-Bloods." Artemis made a mental note to cash in the favor from Tartarus she got from Persephone so that she could be notified the instant Cybertor reformed. She needed to get the monster's measure to know what changes she'd have to make in the hunt's training. From Zoe's descriptions, Artemis was afraid that she'd have to focus the hunt's training on barrier seals, which would necessitate a completely new mindset for the hunt. "So, Zoe, how has the quest been for you besides uncovering several world-shattering revelations? From what little I have heard, it sounds like this quest of Naruto's is turning out to be very different than most other quests." Artemis, like every other Olympian, couldn't observe the quest on Hephaestus TV due to a ban by the fates that Hera had agreed to enforce. Not that most gods and goddesses needed Hera to enforce the ban. Very few deities were stupid or arrogant enough to try and piss off that trio. This meant that she had to find out what was going on with the old-fashioned mortal method. For the next half hour, the lieutenant told her lady about the events of the quest. Artemis was slightly surprised at how bloody the quest had been so far. Having to face a few monsters was expected, some might even say anticipated by some gods and goddesses, but quests typically weren't this bloody. Ares would probably be in hog heaven once he heard how the quest was going. That is, if he didn't try to rail against Hera for keeping him from watching. The fact that dozens of mortals were involved caused an eyebrow to be raised by the goddess. Mortals had been involved in quests before, some had even led quests like Hera's first champion Jason of the Argonauts. But such things had not happened in quests for a long time. The last time a mortal had been involved with a quest was in the 60s, and the last time a large group of mortals was involved in quest was the Crusades. However, the biggest shock to Artemis was when Zoe mentioned the adoption papers that Naruto had shown her. Naruto hadn't mentioned the idea to her yet, so this was completely out of the blue, and she wasn't sure how she felt about it. On the one hand, it was an incredibly touching and dear thought to Artemis. She loved each of her hunters as if they were her own flesh and blood. The thought of being able to call them her daughters was a thought that filled her with happiness. Artemis was fairly certain that she could successfully argue against her spending time with the hunt if they were adopted as her children. She might want to prep a few things first before signing everything just to be on the safe side, but it shouldn't be too hard. Aphrodite would probably be her biggest threat on that front, and several of the gods who might be able to help the slut in an attack on that angle weren't too thrilled with the said slut. On the other hand, part of her was annoyed that Naruto had gotten things set up so far as he had. Shouldn't this have been something that the two of them talked about before Naruto typed up the paperwork? Sure, the paperwork in question couldn't be official until after their marriage, and she signed them, which would at least be a couple of years. That's also not counting the fact that any such document would need the clan seal, and Artemis had that as Naruto's pledge. However, adoption was kind of a major thing for couples, and the fates better have mercy on her idiot fiancé if he thought he could just make a decision like that on his own. His status as the best option for her as a husband would not protect him from being shoved into the doghouse by her after she dragged him over the coals. She was also furious that she was finding out about this from Zoe instead of Naruto himself. Granted, Naruto had revealed it to Zoe in order to comfort her. She also couldn't judge just how long Naruto was planning to do something like this. He could have been planning this for months and slowly wrote up the paperwork, or he could have come up with it during the quest and had his clones draw up the documents during one of his shifts as a guard. Those clones of his made judging the amount of time Naruto spent on a project tricky at best. Then there was the fact that only Naruto, and maybe Hera, knew everything that he kept sealed on himself at all times, or had specifically packed for this quest. After almost a minute of silence, Artemis came to a decision. She had to question Naruto about the adoption papers once he and Zoe got back from their quest. If he had come up with the idea on the spot, and had simply let his enthusiasm get the better of him, then she'd give her future husband a stern talking to. However, if he had been prepping this for months, then his ass was grass. Oh, the goddess wouldn't kill him, but by the time she would be through with him, her husband-to-be would have the golden commandment of marriage burned into his brain. Never ever do anything major or important without first consulting and getting the approval of one's wife. Zoe returned to the rented motel rooms where the trio were staying after she finished speaking to Artemis. Naruto had arranged for the trio to get 2 rooms next to each other. Naturally, Zoe got one cramped room to herself while the boys got the other room. Bucephalus and Skullsplitter were both staying in a penned-in area that the motel had set up for animals. The huntress entered the boys' room and was surprised to see a third person in the room with Naruto and Issei. The third person in the room was an older man of African descent in his mid-40s, dressed in a respectable business suit. It was easy for Zoe to spot the hidden pistol that the man was carrying under his suit coat. She was slightly surprised when she sensed a faint mystical charm on one of the man's pens. Her eyes narrowed slightly. Was this person a messenger from Heptad? Naruto gave Zoe a smile and said, "Welcome back, Zoe. Let me introduce you to Dr. Raymond Langston, MD from the CSI Division of Las Vegas, and an alumni of Camp Half-Blood." That news was relaxing for Zoe, since it meant that they likely weren't about to have to fight again. She gave Dr. Langston a questioning looks for a moment as she tried to mentally gauge his looks and see if she could remember him from the hunt's occasional stops back then at camp. She then said in a slightly unsure tone, "You were a member of Cabin 11. If I remember right, you were one of the claimed campers in that cabin whose divine parent was one of the non-council member deities." "Sorry, but I don't remember anything more about you, Dr. Langston." Raymond gave the lieutenant a small smile and a polite nod of the head. "I am honored that you remembered that much about me, Miss Nightshade. Most people don't tend to remember the children of Morpheus as a few of my siblings can tell you. Of course, as a huntress you are looking as young as ever." The older half-blood's face hardened as he turned to look at the trio. "Now, would the 3 of you mind telling me why I have an 85-man massacre of a crime scene that is so heavily ridden with mist that I am going to have to become extremely creative with in order to sanitize it for mortal consumption? There had better be an extremely good explanation for this, as my time is better spent tracking down criminals that I can send to jail. Let me promise you that if your reason is not good enough in my mind, I will ensure that the 3 of you suffer nightmares the likes of which you cannot imagine for the rest of my life." Naruto spoke up. "Sorry for creating such a headache for you. We didn't want to do that to you." We're on a quest from the Fates to stop a massive threat to Western society. The details of our quest are being kept out of regular Half-Blood circulation by necessity. However, I can share a few facts with you that should make your job easier. That base we hit today was being used by the group that is behind the threat that the Fates sent us to deal with. This group is using mortals to advance its agenda when it is able. Finally, the mortals recruited wanted to commit terrorist actions against the United States, and were under the mist-supported illusion that they were here to launch a nuclear attack. Raymond's face paled when Naruto mentioned a nuclear attack. That was a threat to his city that he couldn't deal with. It was a threat that no half-blood could deal with. Stop a plot to use such a weapon? That he could potentially do if he got wind of it. If the mortals at his latest crime scene wanted to use a nuclear weapon on Las Vegas, then it was a good thing that the young questers had disposed of them. Raymond's only regret now was that someone as young as the boys had to deal with having that much blood on their hands. The half-blood doctor composed himself and said, "I see that the situation did in fact merit the outcome. Now, if you will excuse me, I have a lot of work ahead of me to get everything set for mortals. Also, if you can please try to keep the body count down the next time you're in town. Las Vegas has enough problems without a mystical murder spree occurring." Chapter 35. Morning came for the trio sooner than they would have liked. Zoe woke up and quickly hit the book's translating part of the recovered files from Heptad. Issei watered the trio's rides and picked up breakfast at a nearby Denny's. Naruto was on the phone with Dr. Raymond Langston informing his fellow half-blood of everything that the trio had altered with the mist, and how they altered it. The doctor needed that information to finish making everything at the former Heptad base kosher for mortals. Issei arrived back at his and Naruto's room carrying breakfast, just as Naruto finished his conversation with Dr. Langston. He put Zoe's meal on the bed near where she was sitting with a dozen different books spread out. Then he put the other 2 meals on the table where Naruto was sitting next to the phone that the shinobi had just been using. Naruto grabbed his order and opened. He then selected 2 of the 3 strips of bacon and set them off to the side. A quick glance at Zoe revealed that she had set aside one of her sausage links. The duo looked at each other for a second, glanced at the overhead fire sprinkler, and then back to each other. Within a second of each other they both said, "Outside after breakfast." The last thing they wanted to do was trigger the fire alarm, since they had no idea how sensitive it was. At least with the dinner yesterday they had the candles to judge. The next 7 minutes were filled with the mute noises of the trio eating their breakfasts. Once breakfast was finished, Naruto unsealed his portable altar and picked the reserved pieces of bacon. Zoe followed Naruto while holding her selection of sausage in a napkin. Issei rolled his eyes as his companions left to make their morning offerings. About 3 minutes later, Zoe and Naruto returned to the motel room and resumed their previous seats. Naruto then spoke up, "So Zoe, were you able to figure out what Heptad is planning on doing next from the info we swiped, or do you need more time?" Zoe frowned and said, "I'd like a little more time to double-check some things. If what I'm reading is correct, then the extra time will not be a problem. It seems that Heptad's current plan is to use another Half-Blood's quest to bring the Yata no Kagami into contact with a powerful god or goddess. Apparently, their leadership feels that using it to cause as much chaos and disaster in the mystical world is the best way to salvage their ambitions now that someone is onto them. However, I want to double-check a few things because I'm not entirely sure if I'm looking at a code hidden in a few spots, or it's simply some differences in the dialect they're using compared to what I'm used to reading." Issei cut in at this point with his 2 cents. "If that's the case, then I suppose we'd better let you get back to your books. Naruto and I don't know Arabic, so we can't help you on that issue. While you work on that, I'm going to go and brush Skullsplitter's coat." After Issei left, Naruto pulled out his judgment book and started to add the recent deaths from the Heptad base to the black book. A scowl appeared on Naruto's face when he looked at where he was adding the new names, or in many cases general descriptions, of his latest kills. There would only be a few blank pages in the back of his book by the time he finished his current new entries. This quest had been adding way too many entries to his judgment book. At this rate, he'd need to get a second judgment book started before the quest ended. The thought of having to have another judgment book made Naruto sick to his stomach. Jiraiya had been working on his fifth judgment book when he had been killed. Naruto hoped to never have that many judgment books to his name. After all, part of the reason why Jiraiya had so many kills to his name was because he fought in the second and third Shinobi Wars. At the rate Naruto had been adding names to his judgment book before coming to Earth, he wouldn't have reached this point until he was in his late 30s. Later that day, Naruto headed to a nearby park that had a small fountain in it. The fountain was currently turned off to conserve water in the heat wave the city was dealing with. Naruto looked around at the various mortals and then began to slowly manipulate the mist. A look of concentration set itself on the shinobi's face as he slowly got the mortals to leave this area of the park and then not look at it. Once Naruto was sure he wouldn't cause a scene, he created a shadow clone. A quick check revealed that none of the mortals had noticed what he had done. The clone then took over maintaining the mist manipulations to keep the mortals at bay. Naruto proceeded to unseal 3 large barrels of water from a scroll he had been carrying. He quickly put the barrels next to the fountain, and then climbed into the fountain. The shinobi was once again thankful for those damn D-ranked missions he had been forced to do as a new genin. They might have been aggravating as Tartarus, and almost as painful when it came to the Tora missions, but they gave Genin a wide range of skills that were useful in odd situations. Currently, Naruto put his plumbing skills to work so that one of the spouts in the fountain would turn on once it had water. He then got out of the fountain and quickly poured the contents of the 3 barrels into it. It took a few seconds for the fountain to start shooting up water. A little while after that, enough spray started to form for an ion to be sent. The ninja pulled out a drachma and said, "Please accept this offering, Goddess Iris, and let me speak to one of the staff in charge at Camp Half-Blood." He then tossed the coin into mist where it disappeared in a small flash. Since Naruto didn't specify who exactly he wanted to speak to, Iris decided to put Artemis on the IM. Through the misty view, Naruto saw Artemis from her side giving some instructions to campers in putting away their archery gear. Once she was done giving her instructions, the goddess turned around to look at Naruto. There was a flash of irritation on her face for a moment before she was able to set her face in a more neutral tone. Artemis then asked, "Yes, Naruto, why are you calling camp while you're on your quest?" Naruto quickly replied, "I'm calling to check up on something. Has Percy left on his quest to find my mother's diadem yet?" The question surprised Artemis slightly as she answered, "Yes, he has. In fact, he, Annabeth, and the satyr left with Argus to start the quest 10 minutes ago. I can recall them if you absolutely need it for something, but I recommend against such a move." Left unsaid was the fact that such a move would kick up a hornet's nest among the gods even under the best of circumstances. Considering who Naruto's mom was, who Percy's patron was, and what happening for the past couple of months delaying Percy's quest on Naruto request fell under absolutely terrible circumstances. Naruto shook his head. "That is not necessary, Artemis, but thanks for the offer. Zoe's figured out the next clue on our quest, and it looks like the ones who stole the item the Fates sent me after are planning on using it to interfere with Percy's quest. I just need to know where he's heading, so that the others and I can plan our next move." Artemis nodded her head with a faint look of worry temporarily appearing on her face. Mixing quests usually resulted in problems, and it was vital that these 2 quests succeed. The goddess then said, "Percy and his group are heading towards Los Angeles." For some reason, the oracle's prophecy implied that the Lord of the Dead is involved in the loss of Hera's diadem. Personally, I find this hard to believe. However, Chiron seems to think this, and it is the only clue that Percy has to work on at the moment. Where Percy was heading was a bit of a surprise to Naruto. However, he wasn't going to look a gift horse in the mouth since Percy's journey would almost certainly bring him close to Naruto's quest group. Naruto smiled at Artemis and replied, "Thanks for the heads up. Is there anything else I need to know?" Artemis thought for a moment and then created what looked like a snap-activated glow stick. The glow stick started to glow in a silver-white light for a second before it vanished from her hand and appeared in Naruto's. Artemis then said, "There is something I want to talk to you about, but now is not the appropriate time. Tonight, when you get the chance, go outside by yourself and turn on that glow stick. I'll be able to see it while I'm driving the moon and then we can talk." The goddess then turned her head and said, "Iris, end this message now." With that said, Artemis's image in the misty vision disappeared along with all the mystical aspects of the fountain spray. Naruto then proceeded to reseal the empty barrels back into their scroll. He then looked at the water sitting in the fountain and shook his head. There was no jutsu in his arsenal that would let him pour the water back into the barrels he had just sealed. His control of water jutsus just wasn't that good. He also couldn't just use a jutsu to cause the water to leave the fountain in a harmless manner since he didn't know a jutsu like that. Any water jutsu that Naruto could use would likely cause some property damage, and would be very hard to explain away with the mist. The only option to explain away the water was to manipulate the mist to make it seem like someone had been playing with the fountain's plumbing and this water was the result. While Naruto was talking to Artemis, Zoe was spending her time doing routine maintenance on her bow and arrows near Bucephalus and Skullsplitter. Issei was lying hog-tied on the ground about 2 feet away from the mount's bowls of water. Both northern mystical creatures would occasionally glance at the bound-ons and smirks momentarily seemed to form on their faces. Issei let out a pathetic groan and pleaded with the hunter. "Please let me go, Zoe. It's not like I'm going to cause anyone any harm. Seriously, I wasn't even going to use the weave to get around paying an entrance fee. Don't you think that all of this is going way overboard? I promise I'll be back in 2 hours, and it's not like we've got to move out immediately." A twitch appeared on Zoe's face, and she put her arrow down to avoid damaging it due to improper sharpening. She then turned her head slightly and gave the back of Issei's head a murderous glare as she spoke. "Not a chance in the underworld while we are on this quest, Issei. If I release you from your bonds you'll head straight for that bordello." The bound boy cut her off and said, "It's a titty bar, not a bordello. What is wrong about seeing the good looks that the gods have blessed mortals with when that beauty is put on display for people to see?" Issei then started to go into perverted fantasies over the massive beautiful breasts that were no doubt on display at this very moment. Shortly after these fantasies started, they in consciousness were taken from Issei by a rock to the back of his head. Zoe got up, walked over the unconscious pervert, and picked up her sharpening stone that she had gently thrown. The hunter double-checked the stone to make sure there weren't any problems with continuing to use it as a sharpening stone. She pocketed the stone since she didn't want to risk losing it. It was a good sharpening stone, and it did take a while to find a good one when a replacement was needed. Then in a restrained manner, Zoe gave Issei a kick to the stomach for being an example of a worthless male. Before Zoe could get back to sharpening her arrows, she heard the sound of someone walking towards her and her unconscious teammate. The hunter turned her head and moved her hand to a hidden knife on her person. She relaxed slightly when she saw that Naruto was the person approaching the duo, and relaxed even more when she saw Naruto blink his eyes in a quick pattern they had talked about earlier. Part of Zoe was unused to the idea of secondary passcode to confirm identity, since the kind of deception that would necessitate such security was rare in the mythical world. Such things were common in Naruto's world even if he was more combat-focused, and didn't really pay attention to those sorts of security measures when he was a fresh genin. Naruto took one look at the tied-up and unconscious Issei, and shook his head in disappointment. He was only gone for 45 minutes max and Issei could control himself for that long. Naruto took one look at the hunter and said, "Let me guess. He wanted to go to one of the seedier entertainment centers in the city?" Zoe gave a curt nod of her head, and then started back on sharpening her arrows. Naruto thought about telling about what Artemis told him about Percy's quest. However, a glance told him that Zoe needed to calm down a bit before they could talk about it. That was fine since it should take Percy several days to get near their location. They could talk when Zoe was calm. Actually, it made a bit of sense to wait until Issei rejoined them so then Naruto wouldn't have to tell them the same facts twice. Speaking of Issei, Naruto got an idea on how to pass the time. He unsealed some blank paper and his ink writing set. The physically young shinobi sat down for a moment with his supplies in hand and closed his eyes to think. It had been over 5 years since he had last made the seal he was thinking of, and he needed a moment to remember all of the details. The seal in question was actually his first original creation. Jiraiya had wanted to label it an S-rank forbidden seal, but Tsunade had refused to do so with a smirk on her face. With all of the details fresh in his mind, Naruto quickly went to work making the seal. From start to finish, the seal only took about 5 minutes for Naruto to create. A small smile appeared on the shinobi's face as he remembered the last time he used this particular seal. Jiraiya hadn't been able to figure out if he should be impressed or completely pissed off with the seal had been used on him by Naruto. Zoe saw the smile on Naruto's face and asked, "What have you created?" Naruto turned to look at the hunter and grinned. "This Zoe is my solution for dealing with Issei while we camp here in Las Vegas. While I want us to get some team training in during our downtime, which I will talk more about once Sleeping Hentai wakes up, I know that we can't train 24/7. This seal here will allow us to let Issei have his own fun in the city and ensure that he comes back when he's supposed to return." A look of disgust appeared on Zoe's face at the thought of letting Issei have his time in the filth this cesspit masquerading as a city called entertainment. There had been worse places for a hunter to visit, but Vegas definitely ranked in the top 10 list of cities to avoid if possible for her. She definitely was not thrilled at the idea of questing with someone who would be trying to have as much fun in this city as possible. Issei was barely tolerable now, and any time in the city would most likely make him even more difficult to deal with. This was not blind prejudice speaking, but personal experience that she had acquired over many centuries. Still, part of Zoe was curious about what Naruto had in mind. She raised an eyebrow and asked, "And just how is this seal of yours supposed to keep Issei in line if we were to let him into the city on his own? His self-control is barely above 0 as it is. Letting him indulge in this city's vices will only make his self-control worse." Naruto grinned and said, "That is where this seal comes into play, Zoe. Once I slap it on Issei, only I as the seal's maker can turn it off. This seal has an inbuilt variable timer that I can set to any time I desire. 5 minutes until the timer runs out, the person that the seal is on will start to feel a bad itch. This itch gets worse the closer the timer gets to 0. When the timer gets to 0, the seal will cause whoever it is on to start releasing particularly loud and smelly farts every 7 seconds. 5 minutes after the farting starts, the seal will start igniting the farts. It won't cause Issei's clothes or himself to catch on fire, but the ignited farts will not be pleasant. Trust me, I used this seal on a self-proclaimed super pervert, and even he couldn't last more than 9 minutes after the seal reached 0. The thought about what such a seal could do to Issei put a smile on Zoe's face. She had dealt with several heroes in the past that she would love to have a way to coral them like that. Humiliation and a little pain were far more effective means of busting heroes with exaggerated self-importance down to size. Even that hero had supposedly been easier to deal with for a while after he was forced to wear a dress and act as a queen's handmaiden for a few years as punishment. Sadly, that all ended when he got several more quests under his belt and regained that ego of his that he got for completing his 12 labors. Zoe then shook her head and said, "Well, I guess that will solve one problem. Hopefully, most of the other problems we will face will also be solved." That night Naruto walked up the side of the motel the trio was staying at and double-checked to make sure that he couldn't be observed. Naruto then manipulated the mist to ensure that mortals wouldn't disturb him. Once Naruto was satisfied with his security measures, he turned to look at the moon in the sky. With Artemis's chariot constantly in view, Naruto reached into his pocket, pulled out the glow stick that the goddess had given him earlier and activated it as he held it up to the sky. There was a small and soft circular pulse of silvery energy from the now silver glowing glow stick that lasted for a few seconds. Naruto could hear a hum coming from glow stick that started to get louder and faster, almost as if it was tracking something. Then the circular pulse of light disappeared, and a large beam of silver energy shot out of the glow stick straight towards the moon. Seconds after the beam of energy left the glow stick, Naruto heard the sound of someone lightly stepping onto the roof behind him. He turned around and saw Artemis standing on the roof near him. The shinobi was a bit surprised when he saw Artemis, since she was dressed in a silvery hunting dress of the style she favored back in the heroic age of ancient Greece. The only modern aspect of Artemis's outfit was a scrunchie holding her hair in a ponytail. A closer examination would have revealed that the scrunchie had been hastily put on, but Naruto didn't pick up on those clues. He quickly blurted out, "That was quick, Artemis." Artemis had a small smirk on her face when she heard that comment. She then replied with a bit of mirth in her voice, "No one ever caught anything on a hunt by having a long response time." The mirth disappeared as the goddess continued to speak. "Thank you for activating that glow stick promptly like I asked Naruto. I won't go into details, but without you inviting me to talk with you as you did, we might not have the time needed to talk about what I want to talk to you about while you're on this quest. There were a lot of rules, regulations, and even customs that gods and goddesses had to keep in mind when dealing with half-bloods on quests. Furthermore, the circumstances varied greatly from quest to quest depending on whose children the half-bloods were, what the quest was about, and which deity felt the need to involve themselves in the quest. Any god or goddess who broke these rules could suffer a wide variety of problems ranging from fines to even starting feuds with other deities. Since Naruto was the first half-blood if Hera on the first quest issued by the fates themselves, the situation was murky to say the least. However, there was a loophole in this mess of proceedings, as there always seems to be in complicated legal matters if one knows where to look for it. A god or goddess could talk with a questing hero for as long as they wished without causing any problems if the hero in question asked to talk to them. This didn't happen too often because half-bloods tended to call on their parents for aid, and the rules limiting deities' interactions with their children got in the way on that issue. A fair number of half-bloods preferred to not ask other gods for help on quests, because they didn't want to risk the price that such help might have attached to it. Also, a sizable number of pleas were simply ignored by the god or goddess whose aid was being asked for since they were either too busy, or giving such aid did not help their own plans. Since Naruto had been given the glow stick by Artemis for him to contact her, his activating it in the manner she proscribed carried the same weight for the rules as if he had beseeched her advice in a prayer. Naruto then asked, "So what do you want to talk to me about?" "I'm having trouble thinking about what could be so important that we need to talk about it immediately." That was wrong thing for Naruto to say, causing Artemis to develop a nasty twitch of annoyance. Like any child of Zeus, Artemis had a great temper when it was provoked. However, she also had far more experience controlling her inherited stormy temper than most of her siblings. Having semi-mortal handmaidens and wanting to keep them alive instead of turning them to ash is a wonderful motivator for a teenage goddess to learn self-control. Her voice got tenser, and then she spoke testily. "What could be so important that we need to talk immediately?" "Oh, I don't know. How about those adoption papers you've been working on for my hunters?" Naruto's face quickly showed a deer in the headlights look. It was a sight that Artemis was very familiar with from her hunters. As she always upon seeing that look, the goddess of the hunt moved for the kill. "Zoe told me about the adoption papers when she called me to talk about the Cybertor." "What the Tartarus were you thinking making a move like that?" The shinobi's mind was reset, but he failed to catch on to what was making Artemis angry about the adoption situation. "Look, Artemis, I'm not giving up on finding a way to get you and the hunters out of the bet with Aphrodite. It's just that I've hit a brick wall in trying to find a solution to this problem. Since I couldn't figure out a way out of it for you, I thought that the least I could do was make the situation more bearable for you by recognizing that your hunters are your daughters. Anyone who has seen you with the hunters can plainly see that you look on them like they are your daughters. I figured that the adoption papers would just be legally recognizing the facts of the situation." Part of Artemis's anger was placated by what she heard. It was pleasing to hear that Naruto could see how she cared about her hunters. He had planned this to try and make things better for her. However, that didn't excuse his unilateral actions. She growled out, "That isn't my problem with the adoption papers, Naruto." An even more puzzled look appeared on the half-blood's face. He quizzically muttered, "It isn't?" The goddess gave him a hard stare and quickly answered back, "Yes, Naruto. I'm not mad that you created the adoption papers to recognize how I treat my hunters. I don't see it as you giving up your self-appointed quest. What has me infuriated is that you did this without asking me or even talking about it with me beforehand. You will be my husband, but I refuse to let you become my lord and master." Artemis put her hands on Naruto in a firm grip and drilled into his eyes with her own silver eyes. "My bet was made at a time when men had lordship and dominion over their wives, and many of the customs of Olympus may seem archaic to modern mortals of the West. However, I refused then to come under the command of a man, and I refuse to do so now. What is mine to command and not yours, Naruto." The shinobi in question was feeling about 10 inches tall as Artemis verbally dressed him like he was a recent kill from one of her hunts. His eyes were wide with shock as he tried to process everything that Artemis had told him. Naruto then stuttered out, "That wasn't my intention, Artemis. Honestly, I swear that I wasn't trying to command anything of yours. Look, the whole reason I came up with the adoption plan was to try and help you. I thought it would be something nice for you to take the sting of my failure off of things." Artemis grabbed Naruto's chin with her right hand and held it in place, so that she could look into his eyes. She wasn't that good at reading faces since she was used to just reading mortals' minds. However, the goddess of the hunt had always been good at observing things. It was a very helpful skill to have when one liked to hunt. Since she found out that Naruto's thoughts couldn't be read, Artemis had turned to using her observational skills when she talked with other half-bloods. Over the past couple of years, she had started to learn how to read mortal facial expressions. For the next several seconds, Artemis hunted for any sign that Naruto was lying to her. Finally, the goddess was able to convince herself that Naruto was in fact telling the truth. She let go of him and took a step back. Artemis sighed in a tired manner and then spoke. "Never do something like that again, Naruto. Do you understand me? I like that you came up with such an idea, but don't act on such a thought until the two of us have had a chance to talk and agree upon it." Naruto nodded his head and said, "I understand, Artemis. I promise that I'll do my best not to do something like this again. Honestly, I wasn't trying to step on your toes. I just got so caught up with the idea that I wanted to get as much legwork done as possible. Also, I was planning on talking to you about it first. It's just that Zoe seemed so troubled when we talked a few nights ago. My hope was that mentioning the adoption papers would cheer her up." There was silence for a moment afterward as Artemis nodded her head and accepted Naruto's promise. A small but tired smile appeared on the goddess's face. "I understand, Naruto. I guess there are still many things we both are going to need to learn in order to make our future marriage work." Artemis's body seemed to tense of a split second before she took a step closer to Naruto. She quickly leaned and captured Naruto's lips with her own for their second kiss. A moment later, the goddess ended the kiss and pulled back to see a happily surprised look on the half-blood's face with his cheeks lightly colored pink. She then said, "As I said, there are many things that we both need more practice with to make our future marriage work. However, tonight and while you are on a quest are not the appropriate time for such things. Good luck, Naruto, and I hope to see you and Zoe safely back at camp as soon as possible." With that said, the goddess vanished from the rooftop, leaving Naruto alone. That's it for this reading. Hit like and subscribe for a free ticket pass going to the different worlds of anime fanfictions. Looking forward to having you on board again.